They left this Doberman mother and puppy to die in the heat. What happened next will break you.
Get back
I
here.
heard the sound before I saw anything. A hard, dry
Stop
crack
that.
slicing through the 107-degree F heat of Cedar Hollow like something heavy had slammed into concrete blistering under the July sun. Arizona summers were never gentle, but today the sky felt like it was
I'll teach
pressing
you a
straight
lesson.
down on the
Don't you
town,
dare
determined to
move.
melt the earth into glass. And there was no reason a sound like that should exist in such suffocating silence. For a moment, I thought it had come from inside my own head, some heat-borne hallucination. I stood up, leaving behind the ceiling fan that only managed to push hot air in circles, and then the second sound came a short scraping drag the kind a rope makes when it's yanked hard across cement. My heartbeat stuttered in a way that didn't feel normal. The noise didn't belong to objects or people. It sounded like despair trying to claw its way into the open, and that terrified me. I stepped to the window, my palm landing on the glass that burned like an iron skillet left too long on the stove, and through the white-hot glare I saw Dale Huxley's backyard. He stood there swaying a half-empty bottle, listing in his hand his face flushed red from liquor, and the murderous heat, while the open back door behind him funneled gusts of hot wind that kicked red dust into twisting spirals. Then my eyes dropped to what was at his feet, and my stomach turned cold. A rope was wrapped tightly around the front legs of a Doberman mother. Her entire body was pressed flat against concrete so hot the air above it shimmered like rising steam, her black coat absorbing heat until she trembled in waves that had nothing to do with weakness and everything to do with pain. Her posture wasn't at rest. It was the posture of something fighting for one last breath in a place that offered no escape. It was unbearable to look at. Beside her, a black plastic tub had toppled sideways under the sun, its walls so hot I could see thin distortions of melting plastic lifting off its surface, and inside it lay a Doberman puppy, only a few months old, curled in on itself and shaking like the air had already abandoned it. Its face was pressed against the tub wall, and I knew that plastic softened by heat had to be burning through its paper-thin skin. That sound I'd heard came from there. Not loud, not clear, but sharp enough to cut through the sun, through the silence that tried to swallow every noise of this brutal noon. A thin, exhausted, suffocated whimper. The voice of something praying someone would hear it before it slipped out of the world. It hit me like a blade. I watched Dale bend down and yank the rope again. The jerk was small, but the entire body of the mother convulsed, her muscles locking tight as she failed to lift her head from the scorched concrete, her eyes barely open and vacant, searching for any sign that the world still held someone who might stand on her side. It was a look I'll never forget. My fists tightened without permission. The sun burning into my arms, but the hottest thing in that moment wasn't the air. It was the feeling in my chest, a violent pull of rage, tangled with the fear that I was witnessing the final minutes of two living souls. No one should die like this, especially not in heat that could kill hope itself. I opened my front door, and a furnace blast hit me full in the face. The entire street was empty because everyone else was hiding indoors, avoiding the heat and avoiding trouble. Cedar Hollow had always been that way, the kind of town where mind your own business might as well be the greeting on the welcome sign. But I couldn't be that person. The puppy let out another thin, strangled cry, a sound so short the heat almost swallowed it before it formed, but it cut straight through me. It hit the place inside I thought had dried up the day Laura left. So I looked at Dale's yard one more time, the ground rippling with heat, the rope still taut, the black tub softening under the sun, and the mother dog barely moving anymore. That was the moment everything sharpened. I took a breath quick and burning like fire, because I knew the truth. If I didn't step outside right now, Grace and Ash wouldn't survive long enough to see the air cool. There was no time left to think, no reason left to wait. No one else on that road was coming, It was just me, and the fading cry of two lives begging not to disappear in the heat of summer. Cedar. Hollow was never a place for the faint-hearted, a town that turned into a frying pan every summer, where even the shade burned, the wind scalded, and every breath felt like pulling hot coals through your lungs. It had been my home for 30 years, and there was a time I believed I would grow old here with Laura, my wife, by my side. Those were the years when the heat felt survivable simply because she existed in it with me. But 7 years after she died, the town changed color in my eyes, losing the softness it once held. It didn't feel like home anymore. Mornings no longer came with the break of her radio murmuring in the kitchen, or the smell of coffee drifting through the hallway punctuated by her gentle complaint. "It's going to be a scorcher today, Evan." Now I lived with nothing but the groan of an aging ceiling fan and the desert wind scraping across the porch like an endless, tired sigh. The silence was its own kind of heat. It wore me down. I lived on the outer edge of Dustmere Lane, a dirt road running across a small cluster of low-built houses with sun-bleached metal roofs and windows smothered by thick curtains to block out sunlight that burned like a welder's torch. At noon, the street was so empty you could hear a pebble roll 2 blocks away, and the people here kept to themselves, not out of malice, but because interfering in someone else's life usually meant dragging trouble into your own. It was the only reason Dale Huxley had survived this long without anyone stepping in. People chose the safest distance. His house was 3 doors down from mine, a collapsing wooden structure with a rear roof that had caved in 3 monsoon seasons ago and never once been repaired. He slept through mornings like a stone drank through afternoons and screamed at ghosts through the night, the dim yellow light from his kitchen carving strange shapes into the yard like an unblinking eye, watching the town. Everyone knew him. No one dared get close. Local police knew his name too, but Cedar Hollow was a place where things burned themselves out and cooled on their own. No one intervened unless the fire landed on their doorstep. And I used to be one of them. After Laura died from a sudden stroke on a blistering June morning, I quit my carpentry job in Flagstaff, sold half my tools, and faded into the house we built together. The front door stayed closed. My conversations dwindled, and I lived on routine eating, sleeping, fixing small things while the rest of the world existed behind a pane of desert-dusted glass. I thought grief had made me numb. I was wrong. Because that afternoon, when I heard the mother dog's faint cry from behind Dale's house, something in me that had slept for years jolted awake, sharp and frighteningly clear. Cedar Hollow had taught me to endure silence, but that silence wasn't like any other day. It wasn't the quiet of heat or shuttered homes. It was heavy and tensional, like the entire town was trying not to hear whatever was happening behind Dale's fence. Silence can be cowardice, and I felt it in my bones. I looked out the window and saw no one outside, no cars passing, no children running along the street the way they usually did in the late afternoon. Dustmere Lane lay still under the 107-degree sun, every grain of dust rising like breath from the scorched earth. I knew the habits of this town, its tendency to turn away to pretend not to see. People were afraid. Of heat, of trouble, of Dale, and of truth. And me, I had been one of them. But when I saw the dark shape of the mother dog flattened against that burning red concrete, something simple and brutal cut through me. Laura would never forgive me if I stood behind closed doors and let those 2 souls burn alive. Then came the second whimper, thin, shaking, barely formed before the heat tried to swallow it whole, while the rope tightened and ash kicked weakly against the melted black tub, too hot for escape. My hand clenched until my knuckles turned white. There was no going back. In that instant, I understood that this noon was no ordinary noon. It was the kind of moment a man carries to his grave if he chooses wrong. So I placed my hand on the front door handle, the metal scorching enough to blister skin, and despite the pain, I pushed it open. I stepped off my porch, and the heat slammed into my face like I'd opened the door to an industrial dryer. the air so thick I felt I could slice it with a knife. There was no wind, no cloud. Nothing but a blinding white sun poured over Cedar Hollow like a layer of burning ash that refused to let anything breathe. Even the silence waited, pressing on my ears as if the town itself were holding its breath. 3 houses away, I could already hear the dragging sound from Dale Huxley's backyard. And every instinct in me recoiled. A dry, stretched-out rasp rope grinding against blistered concrete scraped through the stillness, and each time it rose I felt it like my own skin was being pulled across a baking road. It sent goosebumps crawling up my arms despite the heat that could have melted the paint off a car. So I moved faster, my boots kicking up cracked desert dust that broke into tiny ashy clouds, the ground hot enough that the smell rising from it reminded me of metal taken straight out of a forge. Then I reached Dale's fence and stopped, not out of fear, but because I needed 1 second to understand what I was seeing. And that second almost broke me. His backyard was bare, not a single tree or patch of shade, only a red, concrete slab, heated to a shimmering mirage that twisted everything above it like a hallucination. And there, pulled tight against an old wooden post, lay the Doberman mother. Grace. I didn't know her name then. I only knew suffering when I saw it. Her front legs were bound with a thick rope stretched taut, and her black coat drank in the heat until thin waves of haze rose off her body, making her tremble, as if the earth beneath her were shaking too. Her eyes were cracked open, empty of light, holding only the drained exhaustion of something forced past its limit. Beside her, a black plastic tub sat under the full brutality of the sun. Then I heard it, a thin, whistle-like breath coming from inside. I squinted through the glare, Ash. The puppy, no more than 4 months old. He was curled so tightly into a corner of the tub that his whole body looked folded wrong, shivering in quick, sharp jolts. The plastic was so hot I could see faint vapors rising like smoke, and I didn't need to touch it to know it was hot enough to burn a child's skin. Ash pressed his face toward the narrow gap for air, but recoiled each time the concrete scorched the pads of his tiny paws. My throat tightened dry and raw, as if I'd swallowed sand. Then I saw Dale. He staggered near an old wooden table, one hand gripping the edge while the other clutched a half-finished bottle, the sun flashing hard against his arm each time he swayed. He didn't see me or didn't care, and every crash, clatter, and scrape he made sounded less like objects falling and more like something being dragged, shoved, or shaken. And through all of it, the mother dog let out another thin cry, short-strangled, soaked in pain, so real it forced me 1 step back. I knew that sound shouldn't exist. Not anywhere. I knew Cedar Hollow. I knew exactly what people did when they heard noises like that. Nothing. Every house around me was shut tight, curtains drawn, doors locked, and not a single head peeked out. Dustmere Lane sat frozen under the merciless sun, the whole town pretending its ears were plugged and its conscience asleep. The anger that rose in my chest burned hotter than the air not aimed at Dale, but at the silence. In the years I'd spent choosing it. At the grief that had turned me into someone who watched life through a dusty window instead of stepping into it. Then another sound came from the tub. A faint tap, Ash hitting the wall with one weak paw, begging someone to hear him. My chest clenched hard. Not from heat. From truth. If I stepped back, they would die. I moved closer to the fence, my hand landing on the wooden rail that burned like the blade of a knife left under the sun, and I stared at Grace, at Ash, at the stillness of a town that had decided not to care. This wasn't a moment for hesitation or fear or logic. This was the one moment in my life when I had to walk toward pain instead of away from it. So I gripped the fence skin, searing, and whispered into the scorching air, "Hold on, I'm coming." I wasn't thinking anymore. By the time I rounded Dale Huxley's fence, my body, moving ahead of whatever logic I had left, the sun pounding the top of my skull like a red-hot hammer, while the few steps into his backyard felt like walking into a kiln that breathed fire up the back of my neck. The heat was so vicious I half expected my skin to blister before I reached the center of the yard. Dale turned as soon as he heard my footsteps scraping across the concrete, the stench of liquor swirling with sunlight and scorched dust into something thick enough to choke on. His face was the color of burning cement, his eyes foggy but still carrying a sharp flicker of aggression when he saw me. "Evan," he slurred, his voice sticking together like melted plastic. "What the hell are you doing here? Get off my property." I didn't answer. I looked straight at Grace. First, the mother dog pressed flat against concrete so hot it made her fur shimmer like glowing embers, the rope pulling so tight around her front legs that the skin beneath was carved into deep grooves, her body trembling in thin, unsteady ripples, as if she were dissolving under the sun. She dragged in one broken breath at a time, each inhale scraping harshly against heat-scorched air. Then I looked at the plastic tub, and my heart dropped. Ash lay inside, curled tight, panting fast, every exhale fogging the superheated plastic until it blurred his eyes. For a second, I saw the ending right there, one tiny puppy trapped inside a heat-made coffin with no way out. I stepped closer. Dale, braced against the table, regained his balance and barked. "Evan," I said, "back up." But his voice couldn't compete with what I was seeing. Not anymore. I reached down and touched the tub, jerking back instantly, when the plastic seared my fingers like metal straight from a forge. Ash flinched, letting out a strangled little sound. A sound so small, yet so piercing it cracked the suffocating silence open like glass. I spoke slowly, clearly. "They're dying in this heat, Dale. I'm not standing here doing nothing." He staggered toward me, but the heat pulled his footing out from under him, each step wobbling as if he were walking on melting pavement, his drunken anger no match for the furnace swallowing his yard. I used that moment, wrapped my sleeve around my hand, and yanked the lid off the tub. A rush of blistering air blasted my face, as if I'd opened a door into a blast furnace, and Ash lurched out of the corner, collapsing into my arms so light I barely felt his weight, only the frantic burning little breaths against my chest. Grace saw him lift. Her eyes widened not from strength, but from a reason to hold on one more second. Behind me, Dale roared, "You can't take that dog. You got no right." I turned, shielding Ash with my body, my voice steady but low. "I'm not arguing. I'm taking them." Grace tried to twist toward my voice, the rope biting deeper into her legs with the smallest movement. I knelt, my knees slamming onto concrete so hot it stabbed upward through bone, and I wrapped my shirt around my hand again before pulling the rope free from the post. The dry fibers scraped and burned my skin, grinding into it as though trying to carve my palm open, but I kept pulling until the rope snapped loose. Grace fell against me like a shadow made of paper. A full-grown dog shouldn't weigh that little. It nearly broke me. Dale lurched forward, his face blazing red. "Evan, don't you—" I met his eyes once. Not challenging, not threatening. Just a man who had already made his choice. "Not today, Dale." Then I lifted both mother and puppy and ran every step, stabbing through the heat, as if I were sprinting across a bed of coal, sweat pouring down my arms, while the sun and the melting plastic scorched every exposed inch of skin. I didn't look back. Not once. I yanked open the door of my old Ford F-150 set. Ash, gently on the back seat, eased Grace beside him and blasted the AC to full power, even though I knew it would take minutes to overcome the heat trapped inside the cab. I climbed behind the wheel. My hands were shaking from the burn, and from the fear that these 2 lives might slip away before I reached Cedar Ridge Animal Clinic 3 miles up the road. I turned the key. The engine cranked to life, and I tore out of that yard under an Arizona sky burning itself open. By the time I pulled the Ford F-150 up to Cedar Ridge Animal Clinic, the AC had finally pushed the worst of the heat out of the cab, but I was nearly spent, my left arm numb from holding Ash and my right hand throbbing with the burn left by ripping that rope free from Dale's post. None of that mattered, though, not compared to the fractured breathing beneath my ribs. Grace's breaths were so weak I had to lean down to check whether her chest was still rising at all, while Ash trembled uncontrollably, his eyes wild, as if he still didn't believe he'd escaped the sun-baked trap he'd been roasting inside. I flung open the truck door and yelled, "Mare and Jenny, anybody here?" The clinic door burst open. Dr. Marin Lewis, mid-40s, hair tied back, sharp eyes softened by kindness, ran straight toward me, with Jenny Marsh behind her carrying a tray of supplies and a cooling towel. Marin saw Grace first and stopped for half a second, breath catching. "Dear God. Evan, what happened?" "All you need to do is save them," I answered. She nodded hard, the kind of nod made by someone who's met death too many times and still chooses to fight it. Jenny lifted Ash from my arms, and he was so light my hands felt abruptly empty, while Marin guided Grace onto a stretcher, and I walked beside them, keeping her head steady as we rushed inside. There was no breeze in the ER room, but compared to outside, the air felt like heaven. They pulled the curtains shut and switched on the cooling fans immediately. Marin placed a hand on Grace's abdomen, checking each faint breath. Heat exhaustion. Severe dehydration. Extreme stress. Each word is sharp, quick, and precise. Jenny had a fluid line into Grace within a minute, the needle sliding into skin so dry and overheated it barely gave any resistance, but Grace didn't flinch. That wasn't a good sign. Any healthy adult dog would have jerked or whined. Grace's silence was the silence of collapse, not calm. I stood at the edge of the room with a throat as dry as the desert outside, the white lights reflecting off Grace's black coat until it looked like scorched metal. Her ribs were too visible. Her strength was almost gone. Jenny moved to Ash next, placing him on a cooling cloth and stroking his neck and chest to bring his temperature down slowly. Ash let out a tiny broken hiss, not from pain but from shock, then gradually eased as the coolness touched him. For the first few seconds he scanned the room like it might be another trap, his eyes darting everywhere for something familiar. And then he saw me. Just a second. A trembling, hesitant look. And in his eyes was more than fear, there was a question. "Were you the one who pulled me out of that heat?" My heart slammed against my ribs. After so many years alone, after losing Laura, after watching life dry up around me, I never imagined a look that small could wake something so deep. Marin spoke quickly. "Evan, keep the little one calm. We've got the rest." I moved closer, sat beside the table, and kept my voice as steady as I could. "You're okay, Ash. You're safe now." Ash shook once more and then unexpectedly shifted forward and placed his head against my finger. A tiny touch, but it stopped the whole room. Marin noticed and said, "Good. He's identifying you as safe." I couldn't answer. My throat was too tight to form anything more than breath. Grace drew in a slightly stronger breath, not deeper, but with more force. Marin gave a small, relieved smile. She's coming back. Slowly, but she's climbing out of it. I stared at the two of them, chest-knotted, unsure of what would happen next, whether Grace would survive, whether Ash would recover, whether Dale would show up demanding trouble, but one thing had already shifted inside me. I wasn't the man at the window anymore, watching life pass behind layers of dust. Somewhere in the 107-degree heat of Cedar Hollow, I had found a reason to keep living. Or maybe these two small lives had found me. Afternoon in Cedar Hollow didn't soften at all. The sunlight still hammered against the windows of Cedar Ridge Animal Clinic, as if it meant to melt the entire building into cast iron. The ER's AC ran at full power, yet heat still slipped through every crack, like a reminder that outside the sun hadn't spared a soul. After 2 hours on fluids, Grace was breathing more steadily. Not strong, but steady, her chest rising in small rhythmic lifts, her half-closed eyes no longer trembling the way they had when I first carried her in. Ash was practically glued to the cooling towel, his head still resting on my fingers, as if letting go would drop him back into the furnace he'd escaped from. I thought everything was finally beginning to stabilize. I was wrong. A sharp noise came from the prep room behind us, a metal tray slipping from someone's hand and hitting the floor with a hard, dry clang. But for Ash, that sound was Dale's hammer falling from the sky all over again. He shot upright instantly, his whole body convulsing, eyes blown wide with terror, scrambling into the corner of the table before smashing his head against the cold steel bar and then forcing himself against the wall as if running from a fire no one else could see. Grace heard it too. Her body tightened, breath stuttering, one leg curling in as though the rope had cinched around it again. Jenny gasped, "Evan, he's panicking. Don't touch him yet." I froze where I stood. Ash shook so violently the metal table trembled with him, each breath coming in ragged bursts like the air was being torn from his lungs. And in that moment, the entire clinic vanished from my vision. I saw Laura. That final night in the ICU. A metal sound hits the floor. Laura, jolting breath, spiraling out of control. I didn't reach her hand in time. I didn't calm her. I didn't say I'm here. A single metallic crash. And the person I loved most slipped away. I returned to the present on the sound of Ash's fractured breathing, another life drowning in panic. And this time I would not stand by and watch. Jenny whispered, "Evan, let him see you. Don't force it. Don't reach. Get lower, near the floor." I nodded and slowly lowered myself to the cold tile, just an arm's length away, positioning my face level with his eyes. No movement. No reaching. Just presence. I inhaled slowly, deliberately, so he could hear my rhythm without feeling threatened. "Hey, Ash." My voice shook and I forced it steady. "It's me, Evan. The one who pulled you out of the heat. The one who opened the tub. The one who carried you in here." Ash didn't look at me. He pressed his face harder into the wall, breathing in sharp, broken pulls. I kept talking, each word lay gently into the empty space between us, like placing stones across a deep ravine. "There's no sun now. No rope. No Dale. No one is touching you." For a long moment, nothing shifted. Then he stopped shaking for exactly 1 second. Just one. But that 1 second was the first crack in a wall of concrete fear. I breathed in slowly. "If you want to, you can come to me. If you don't, I'll sit here. For as long as you need." I opened my hand, palm down on the floor so it wouldn't look like a threat. I went still enough to hear the AC hum and the faint rattle of metal from the room next door. Ash looked at me. Barely. A trembling, hesitant glance, one full of fear but also the terror of being betrayed again. But he looked. I whispered, "Good. You're doing so good." Ash inhaled sharply, then slowly, crawled out from the corner. Not fast, not directly, just inch by inch, as if each movement was a battle against a memory I couldn't see. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. It took nearly 10 minutes that felt like a lifetime before Ash touched his nose to the edge of my boot. A real touch. Not accidental. Not out of fear. The touch of a creature trying to believe once more. My head bowed, eyes burning. "I'm here. I'm not leaving you." Jenny lifted a hand to her mouth, tears gathering. Marin stood behind her, her expression softening. "Evan, that's a choice. He chose you." The ER fell silent. No fan noise, no metal clangs, no desert wind. Just a small ritual of healing one frightened life, placing trust in the person who pulled him out of Cedar Hollow's burning heat. And I knew that moment bound me to this path forever. That evening, the sun finally slipped behind the red hills of Cedar Hollow, its heat no longer burning, but brushing gently against the recovery room windows like it was offering an apology for punishing the town all day. The air felt cooler, quieter, softened by dusk in a way that made the whole world exhale. And when I stepped into the room, I saw Grace sleeping deeply for the first time since we arrived. This time, she wasn't sleeping from exhaustion. She was sleeping in peace. Ash lay tucked beside her, curled into a tiny dark shape, his head resting on her stomach, his breaths soft and even like wind gliding across a field at sunset. I stood in the doorway with my hand on the frame and watched the two of them for a long while, realizing I had never seen anything so fragile, or anything so fiercely resilient. It struck something inside me, something I thought had died. Marin came to my side. Her voice lowered. "Evan, they're going to make it. Not easily, but they will." I nodded, but my throat closed up not out of fear but from a relief so sharp it hurt. Jenny stood behind her arms wrapped around a folder. "The next step is finding someone who can keep caring for them. Ash is already attached to you. Grace, too." She looked at me like she already knew the answer. I stepped closer to the table. Ash opened his eyes and looked straight at me, not shaking, not startled. His eyes reflected the white lights, but beneath them, I saw something unmistakable. Trust. The kind I thought had been burned away in Dale's yard, the kind neither of them believed they'd ever find again. I rested my hand gently on Grace's head. Her coat was still warm but no longer scorching, and she tilted into the touch with a single firm breath that seemed to say, "We lived. Because of you." And I understood in that moment I hadn't saved them. They had saved me from the dry, hollow life I'd been drowning in since Laura died. I sat down, placed my hand on Ash's back, and whispered, "Come home with me, both of you." Ash licked my finger. A clearer answer than words. Marin smiled. "Well then, that settles it." Cedar Hollow's newest family. When I lifted Ash and helped Grace off the table, it felt like carrying a piece of my own long-lost heart, something I thought the desert had taken from me for good. The evening breeze was so gentle it felt unreal, and the small town under the sunset looked different, less empty, less silent, less broken. It felt alive. It felt possible. That night, when I opened my front door, the two of them stepped inside as if the place had been waiting for them all along. Ash wandered to the corner and curled up on the old rug Laura once stitched. Grace lowered her head onto my leg and closed her eyes again, this time not from exhaustion, from safety. Cedar Hollow had looked away from their suffering, but one person stepping forward had changed their fate. And if anyone ever hears this story, I hope they understand one thing. You don't have to save the whole world. You just have to save one trembling life in front of you. And sometimes, that's enough to make the whole world kinder.